You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes over and bulldozed their villages, seized their property under laws they had no part in making?
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 478 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. It's a Monday, and so I have Will Porter on the show. We're talking about some of the writing he's done over the past week. He is a staff writer at RT. In the past, he's published articles over at antiwar.com, Libertarian Institute, Consortium News, and has a large archive at the Daily Sheeple. Will, welcome back to the show.
Always glad to be back on. How's it going, Kyle?
It's great, and I really like having you on this Monday slot because I think one of the things I get from you is not only all of your writing over the past week, but I think we often talk about stories that are going to be coming and talked about and discussed heavily in the coming week. This is something that happened when we talked about the USS Theodore Roosevelt and the corona outbreak there. Well, Will, now we have an outbreak on another aircraft carrier, so give us the details on that.
Yeah, so something we have been covering the last few weeks is sort of just the impact on the military in general of this pandemic. And the Navy has been one of the more they've come up more frequently, particularly because on Navy vessels, it's hard to isolate. And so, a pandemic is particularly well suited for a small vessel like this. And so, as you said, we now have some indication that there may be another outbreak on another U.S. aircraft carrier. And so last Thursday, you had John Hyten, who's the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and an Air Force general. He came out and said that there was a very small number of infections on board the USS Nimitz, which is a super carrier with a crew of 5,000. And I think right now it's parked off of the coast of Washington State. It's not on deployment, unlike the Roosevelt. And so Hyten had said that these infected sailors had been isolated, had been, moved away from their other crewmen to avoid infecting them and stuff, and that there was not very many of them. But a weird part about this is that soon after Hyten came out and said this, and he's a pretty high-level guy. I think he's technically the second highest-ranked officer in the military as the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Soon after he said this, though, the Navy came out and denied it and said that there actually was not an outbreak on board the Nimitz. They said instead that there was one sailor who had displayed symptoms and that he was isolated off the ship along with his close contacts. But they said that was all just a precaution and that he didn't actually have the virus. And then they said that a second guy had tested positive, but he was on leave at the time and hadn't been on the ship since he had contracted it. However, right around the same time that Hyten had come out and made his comment, you also had Politico reporting. They ran a story where they sourced 3 military guys, all anonymous, of course, but 3 guys saying that there was at least one sailor who had showed symptoms and tested positive while on board the Nimitz. So, contradicting what the Navy claims. And so it could very well be that Hyten and Politico and its sources are just wrong and there's no outbreak on the ship, as the Navy's saying. But I'm kind of skeptical of that. I'm kind of wondering if they decided that this should not have been publicized and that for whatever reason, Hyten had let this thing slip. And now they're sort of in damage control mode. The Nimitz would be the 4th aircraft carrier, I think, to have coronavirus on board out of a total of only 11, I believe there are in the whole Navy. And so, and there have also been a few other warships with outbreaks on board too. So I wonder if they're just deciding that wow, we really don't want this to be published, to be shared or publicized anymore. You'll remember that right after the commander of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, another aircraft carrier, which we've discussed the last few times I was on, soon after the commander of that ship sent the letter asking for the evacuation, there was a pretty big outbreak on board that ship. I think it ended up being over 400 sailors in total. The Pentagon, though, that prompted them to stop sharing specific information about infected soldiers and sailors. And they said, from now on, we're not going to publicize this. We're only going to give you an aggregated number, but we're not going to say anything about where the infected soldiers are. And so I'm just wondering, given that they're trying to clamp down on this information, it is a bit weird that Hyten would come out and say this at all. It's not like this is some leaked thing. He told reporters at the Pentagon. But I am just wondering now if they're trying to keep this information under wraps. The Navy. And so, at this point, we actually don't know. There may or may not be an outbreak on board the Nimitz. We have some conflicting information. I think we have pretty good reason to believe that there's something to this reporting and something to what Hyten said. But yeah, I think there's also some reason to suspect that the Navy is trying to, keep wraps on this. But, with the conflicting info, it's kind of hard to say. about, definitively if there is an outbreak. But again, it would be like the fourth aircraft carrier and like the seventh ship now, I think, for an outbreak. So it wouldn't be unheard of. But I would just wonder too, like, how many ships can they have outbreaks on before it really starts, affecting naval operations? And I wonder if that's also playing into their desire to share this information in the first place, because, it might actually start having an impact.
All right. Well, there's a couple things in there I want to comment on and a question I want to ask you there. But I think it's kind of all circled, hopefully, to the question I'm going to try to ask my comments here. So, we have the former now Secretary of the Navy, Thomas Modly, who, when he went to the Theodore Roosevelt, he gave a speech basically saying that the U.S. right now is at war, or essentially needs to be at war, with China, or prepared for war with China. Basically, we're on red alert for war, which is the exact opposite thing that Captain Brett Cozier said in his letter, which is we're not at war, so we should prioritize the safety, of our sailors. And so I think that's an interesting discrepancy where, you have the I think Trump administration, and Modly seems to be somebody who was definitely kind of on board with the Trump agenda, especially the Trump agenda on China. And they really believe that, like, hey, we're like on the cusp of war here. We have to take all these aggressive naval actions, whereas it really doesn't seem like that needs to be the case at all. And so I guess that also adds to like another thing that you said in there, when it really starts to affect naval operations. I really wonder, Will, if there's anywhere in the world right now that the U.S. actually needs its Navy to carry out effective operations. I mean, there may be surveillance ships somewhere, and of course, like the nuclear submarines have their role that would, remain constant in naval operations as being like, the nuclear deterrent against Russia or whatever. But as far as like, the aircraft carriers and the destroyers go, what really are they doing other than just yesterday we sailed a destroyer through the Taiwan Strait? And, we're conducting different kind of freedom of navigation operations all over the world. We're putting a second aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf to threaten Iran. But assuming that, there's no way we actually go to war with Iran during this coronavirus, it all comes down to, do you see the same discrepancy that I do between like the Trump administration and that reality that the actual U.S. soldiers that are living there are able to observe that the leadership isn't?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly see that discrepancy. In the Captain Crozier's letter, he was pleading, saying we're not at war. So, sailor, the whole context of it, he was saying I'm willing to sacrifice my soldiers, and they're all willing to sacrifice their lives to protect the country, but we're not at war. And Modly replied by basically saying, no, you should be acting like you are at war because, China covered up the Wuhan outbreak or something. I forget how he exactly made that syllogism. But yeah, certainly there is a discrepancy there. They're always, looking to be on this war footing, and they always want to find an excuse to act like we're at war. But it does seem like in a lot of cases, like the USS Roosevelt was, it had a mission in the South China Sea, very far away from our shores. And so often these things end up being just like big floating tripwires. And now they seem to be big floating virus sponges or something. Like this is just a liability to have these things so far out away from home, and you end up having these like, emergency crisis situations like on the Roosevelt where you have to send out all these other guys. You have to divert its mission. And so, maybe this is a sign that we should not be having so many far flung missions so far away from our shores right now during this health crisis, because, these things end up being big floating liabilities out there in the ocean.
Right. Well, there is this interesting scenario here where in the worst nightmare of like the Hudson, D.C., you actually have a situation right now where we have a whole bunch of our military assets deployed all over the world that could essentially kind of be quarantined and locked down in that area. And, if there was ever like an actual, like, this threat that we always had to prepare from, that's why we need 11 aircraft carriers. If that actually existed, it seems like right now all of our overseas intervention would really be coming back to haunt us as, we have 5,000 soldiers stranded in Iraq, 8,000 in Afghanistan, who knows how many in Africa, a few thousand, some thousand in Saudi Arabia, and other countries in the Middle East. Like this could be a real logistical nightmare. But, there's actually not really a threat to the U.S. homeland. I mean, we have two massive oceans. The worst thing that comes through the borders, according to anyone, is a refugee and drugs. And so it's not like there's any threat of an invading army from anywhere. And it's so like that consequence doesn't come to play, but it has drawn a lot of interesting, parallels, and people have been writing articles about like, oh, the fall of Rome and everything. And I do think it's worth it, to make that observation and kind of realize that, like, if we were really facing all the threats that the government said they would, the situation that they now put us in, we would be made completely vulnerable to it. So even by their own, like, kind of flawed view of reality, they're losing, the game they're playing.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, just, having it's been a pretty common argument among non-interventionists that, having your forces spread all across the world might not actually be the strongest position to be in. You might actually end up, shooting yourself in the foot that way.
I did want to ask, Will, if you have anything else to add on the Theodore Roosevelt. I covered Modley's resignation last week after he gave that atrocious, announcement to the rest of the ship. But, do you have any other thoughts on it? Because I just do think it's such an important story to kind of see the actual soldiers, this captain in the case, stand up to the leadership. And overall, with Modley ended up having to resign, I think publicly, we see that, the public does support those soldiers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of curious what might have happened behind the scenes with this whole thing, because they say that Modley, because he resigned after he came out and criticized the captain of the Roosevelt, called him naive and stupid, said that he committed a betrayal by sending that letter. But the military says that he resigned on his own accord, that Modley did after all this, because he kind of, there was kind of like a controversy over what he had said about this captain. But this did happen right after the president said he was going to get involved in the case. And so, whatever that actually means, I'm not sure. But I do wonder if maybe it had something to do with Trump getting involved, because we remember the last acting Navy secretary, Richard Spencer, that guy was fired after over disagreements about Trump's involvement in the case of the Navy SEAL, Eddie Gallagher, who was, convicted of war crimes and stuff. And knew Trump kind of helped him get off and like get him reinstated with the SEALs, I think. And so Spencer was fired over like that whole controversy after the president had gotten involved. And so I just wonder if maybe this other Navy secretary was a sort of if that was what had caused his firing too, because it did seem to come out of nowhere. It seemed like they fired this captain, Captain Crozier of the Roosevelt. And I think it was Modley. I think he was involved in that decision. But I don't know. It seemed as if the military was unified over that. Esper seemed to be down with it. But then suddenly, this Modley guy turns around and resigns. So I just wonder what changed and why. I don't actually have an answer, but maybe it had something to do with the president.
Yeah, somebody posted on Twitter that essentially Modley fell on his sword here, and he went to give the speech to make himself the lightning rod, so that essentially all the hate focused on him. So when he resigned, it dissolved, and that even if that wasn't intentional, it certainly played out that way and worked out well for Trump. Will, last week we got news that you're not going to believe this. The OPCW says that Assad used chemical weapons 3 times in 2017. And as far as I could tell, that none of these 3 events are ones that you have debunked in the past on the show. And I'm not quite sure even what evidence the OPC has put out. So, just give us the details of what we know about this right now. It doesn't, seem to be getting a whole lot of coverage and scrutiny, and people are just kind of reposting, hey, OPCW, International Chemical Watchdog Group, I think mainstream media just kind of labels as the definitive voice on the issue, says Assad used chemical weapons again. So what say you, Will Porter?
Yeah. So the OPCW's newest investigating mechanism in Syria, what they've called the Inspection and Identification Team, has issued its first report last week. And as you said, accusing Syria of using chemical weapons, sarin and chlorine in 2017 in this town in western Syria in the Hama governorate. Now, I should say I haven't actually gotten a chance to really carefully go through this report and as I have with previous OPCW material. So I can't really evaluate fully the claims they're making here. That sort of takes some time to go through and to evaluate. And I also like to read other analysis and stuff too, and there hasn't been much yet. But and as we've discussed a lot previously, there have been a lot of issues with the OPCW's work. With the alleged chemical attacks in Ghouta, in Khan Sheikhoun, in Douma. We've gone over a lot of this on the show before. And there's been a lot of whistleblowers now too with the OPCW. I think 4 now who've come forward and said the OPCW is driven by a specific agenda, and that its reports are sort of tailored to fit a certain narrative, and leaving out all kinds of relevant information to drive a certain narrative. And so I can't quite say if this newest report suffers from those same problems. But I think there is something at least notable about this new inspections mechanism itself that we can comment on. So unlike what they called the fact-finding mission, which is the mechanism set up to investigate previous chemical weapons claims in Syria, the fact-finding mission did not have a mandate to attribute responsibility. It was only sent out to determine whether chemical weapons had in fact been used, but not to cast blame. So unlike that, this new inspection and identification team is going to point fingers and accuse specific actors of responsibility right from the get-go. That's part of its mandate. It's built right into it. And the OPCW actually in 2018 had adopted this new approach. That's when they agreed to create this new mechanism, but it just now finally released its newest report. And they did this at the urging of the U.S. and the U.K. and a few other governments within the OPCW, urging for this new kind of model where they can cast blame on actors rather than just investigating whether weapons were used at all. And the OPCW, that doesn't actually have any legal authority itself to enforce anything, and so it's up to the UN and its member states to pursue any punishment or consequences for what the OPCW concludes. But still, with this new mechanism, it's going to be easier for governments like the U.S. to weaponize the OPCW with this, and it's going to directly make accusation. And so I think that's a significant development with this new thing. They created it in 2018, but they just now are using it. Maybe in a future show we can go over the specific factual claims of this newest report, because there are 3, I think, different allegations in this town in 2017 that they're making. We can say, though, of course, that the Syrian government has rejected it. They've come out and said that it's false, and they're claiming that the OPCW relied on opposition sources as they have in the past, and so that's not inconsistent with what we know about the OPCW. And then the Russians, of course, the Syrians' closest ally in their war, the Russians have said the same thing, and they've also said that they said that this newest report actually relies on information provided by Western intelligence agencies. But until I actually get to really dig into the facts and the claims of this report, I can't really evaluate either of their reactions to it. But nonetheless, the Syrians have rejected this new report.
Right. So, one, I guess, interesting thing about this is the lack of media coverage, apparently now or before, because I did try to go back and kind of Google around that time, and there really wasn't anything, at least in Western media, about any of these chemical attacks other than alleging that, so many chemical weapons attacks were alleged to have happened in this month. Again, I think a lot of the analysis that we've made over, the course of time about these chemical weapons attacks stands that it's not beneficial for Assad. He knows that this is going to provoke a U.S. attack against him, and this is going to be more sanctions, and his country desperately needs to be able to economically recover, and that's harmful. I read that the EU was talking about new sanctions on Syria right now because of this that allegedly happened in 2017. The facts on the ground changed so much since then. Well, just looking at the 3 reports that, we've seen, and we've really broken down the Khan Sheikhoun one and the Duma one on this show, and now we have this. It seems like there's a pretty clear slide here from the OPCW in their willingness to, kind of just smear the Assad regime, where, at first, they kind of just, I think in the 2013 attack, we really just saw they put out analysis. When we got to Khan Sheikhoun, there was people showing up at the hospital before the attack happened, and this just ends up in the annex and not some report. We've gone over detail of all these whistleblowers that have come out and said how the Duma report is garbage. My guess is that we see that, the next step here that, this like Duma, maybe even worse, that this is, just kind of thinly sourced. But I guess, have you noticed the same thing that I did pretty much from corporate media? All we're having here is just a repeat of the headline and, no, critical analysis of, this is the group that Assad is alleged to have gassed. This is, the result of the attack or anything like that. Or is it just, same thing glossed over?
Yeah, I mean, it seems pretty much anytime the OPCW comes out with any kind of pronouncements, you can't really count on the mainstream press, the corporate press, to critically, dig into it the way that we do, to actually look into some of the, at least in what they print, at the New York Times and stuff. You certainly don't see much critical analysis of these kind of claims, which, as we've seen, you should be critical of these claims because, when you dig into some of the things like with the Duma attack, you see some of these weird, inconsistencies, or like we said with Khan Shaykhun, people showing up to the hospital complaining of chemical weapons symptoms before the alleged attack takes place. In Duma, you have some of the people working on the fact-finding team. You have them sort of complaining like, hey, that's like when the final reports come out, they're like, hey, that's not what I had found in my analysis. Or, hey, you omitted my entire, technical engineering assessment that decided that, or that concluded that, it was more likely these chemical weapons canisters were placed there manually at the scene. And in my skimming of this newest report, I see there are some similar kind of like forensics they're putting forward, claiming to find these canisters. And so I look forward to some of the independent analysis from real experts like, Theodore Postel, who's an expert in like ballistics, I think. And so it'll be interesting to see what, actually qualified people can determine from some of these forensics. But I'm also just curious if there are any like, just glaring inconsistencies or glaring, just things that stick out like that, like people showing up to hospitals before alleged attacks and, omitted sections and annexes or things that are buried in annexes. And so I don't know, like there's a lot of possibilities with this newest report, but certainly with the media coverage, you're just seeing, a repeat of what we've seen with these last three high profile claims, just sort of total acceptance and no critical faculties or whatever.
Yeah, and I will say this is something I've talked about in the show in the past, feeling like the OPCW has been increasingly influenced by the U.S. to the point where at the Duma report, I believe it's the story from the whistleblower outlets that says, that 3 Americans were in the meeting and basically told the OPCW what conclusions to find. So, all that stuff. And again, I'm sure this is something that we will talk about, more in the future, especially if the U.S. and other Western countries look to act against Syria for this accusation. It may just be that nobody notices it because of the coronavirus, which is how much attention that gets. Another story that hasn't gotten really noticed because of the coronavirus, but it is critical for that country, and that is the Iran was denied a loan from the IMF for $5 billion, and the U.S. was involved in that. So let's give us the details there.
Yeah. So right now and for the last month or so, Iran's been trying to secure this $5 billion emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. And they're saying they need this to help, fight their coronavirus outbreak, which in Iran's is the worst in the whole region. I think they have the worst outbreak in the whole Middle East. Right now, they've got like 70,000 cases and well over 4,000 deaths. And those are just the official figures. And if you look and see how this outbreak has been growing in other countries, there's probably a lot more in Iran. Like they were reporting like tens of thousands like a month ago. And so it's probably well in excess of what they're saying right now. And, a lot of this just has to do, it might not be a cover up or something. A lot of it just has to do with the testing. But, very well, the Iranian authorities might decide they don't want to share this too. So of course, though, as you mentioned, the U.S. has been trying to block this loan. They've, the State Department from pretty early on made its position very clear, saying that like Iran should not get any funds it shouldn't get any emergency loan whatsoever. And they're claiming that, they can fight the outbreak without it. And they have all the resources they need, which seems, that's not quite true. They're struggling with it quite a bit. And you also had one anonymous official telling Bloomberg that Iran didn't need this because the Ayatollah has billions of dollars of his own stashed away that they should use. And so either way, this is something you should remember, I think, when you hear U.S. officials insisting that the so-called maximum pressure campaign and the sanctions don't hurt Iran's ability to receive aid or, assistance in its outbreak fighting the coronavirus, because that's just not true. Like the sanctions and the pressure campaign have certainly gotten in the way of Iran's ability to fight its outbreak. And the IMF loan is just the latest example. The U.S., putting pressure to get that blocked. You actually just had some EU states sending aid to Iran, medical supplies, but to do so, they had to circumvent, to sidestep U.S. sanctions. And I think it was the first transaction. I think it was two weeks ago or 3 weeks ago or something, or maybe 2. But either way, it was the first transaction through Instex, which is this trade mechanism the Europeans set up like over a year ago to try to circumvent U.S. sanctions and facilitate transactions with Iran. And it took them forever to finally use it. But that's more evidence that the sanctions campaign is interfering with Iran's ability to get aid, because the fact that the Europeans even have to use this Instex thing to send them assistance. And part of the deal with the American sanctions is that it prevents Iran from dealing with a whole bunch of different international financial institutions like SWIFT. And so they are able to receive some forms of direct aid, but they can't actually go out and buy a lot of the things they need from overseas because of the sanctions, because they simply can't do the transactions. And so again, this is all definitely hurting their ability to fight the virus. A couple of weeks ago, you actually also had four former senior American and European diplomats, including four former heads of NATO, come out and urge the Trump administration to ease the sanctions on Iran because they were saying that these were severely compromising its healthcare system. They said that it was making importing medical supplies go way slower, and in some cases made it impossible because a lot of these suppliers are afraid of violating the sanctions. Even if they are technically allowed to send them, under the letter of the law, a lot of these companies are just afraid to do it because they're afraid they're going to be hit by the U.S. And so these diplomats said that for all these reasons, it's making it way worse. It's making it way harder for Iran to fight, the coronavirus. And of course, the UN has also come out, and Human Rights Watch and all these other groups have come out and pointed out all these different ways that the sanctions are making it harder, and it's having a lot of harmful effects on Iran's healthcare industry. And so, regardless of how much, officials like the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, all kinds of U.S. officials are insisting that the sanctions don't hurt Iran and don't hurt, it has no humanitarian effect. That's just simply not true. There's all kinds of different ways in which our pressure campaign harms them. And this IMF loan is just the latest example of that.
On top of everything else, there's also the group United Against Nuclear Iran, and this is something that Eli Clifton has written about a few different times now. And this is a pressure group that's closely tied with the Trump administration. And so even let's say you have a company like Eli Lilly, who's a medical company who actually does have exemptions from the U.S. sanctions against Iran, and could use some kind of either the Swiss route or the Instex route to do trade with Iran. Well, then you had this group that will actually wage kind of a public pressure campaign to try to get them not to do that business. So essentially, United Against Nuclear Iran is Carol Baskin, who's emailing all the malls telling them not to let Exotic Joe do business there, and it's I guess been somewhat successful in preventing people from doing business with Iran. The other interesting thing is you had that you mentioned that the Ayatollah has billions of dollars, so why doesn't he just buy it? I don't think this is a case where, while Iran's economy is struggling and somewhat crippled, I don't know if this situation is that Iran needs the IMF loan because they need $5 billion, or they need the line of credit to be able to actually facilitate trade. As you point out, they've only used this Instex thing once. The Swiss route is very difficult. Again, you have the groups like United Against Nuclear Iran interfering and everything else that Will mentioned. And so one of the things that I was thinking with the IMF loan is it would be somewhat like the deal that Marcon was proposing to extend the line of credit to Iran, that would basically allow to facilitate trade. Because even if the Ayatollah is literally sitting on $1 billion of cash, he's sanctioned, and so nobody could do business with him. And we talked in the past about how they label these items dual use, and so while it may be a surgical mask, which is something you need, it could also be used in some kind of construction in Iran that's sanctioned or that, and so they're now unable to import it. And I don't know, anything else on Iran, Will?
No, I think you hit it there. That's one of the most important aspects of this is to understand how they're unable to facilitate transactions across borders. That's a huge thing, holding their economy back, holding their ability to sell oil back, all kinds of things. So that's important thing to focus on.
Right, and I do believe the Iranian government does have quite a number of assets and accounts that have been frozen. So I know people talk about this is bad because it does put the Iranian people on the hook, and they IMF loans are known to be predatory, and that could certainly end up being the case. This is quite the unique situation where Iran is in desperate need of medical equipment to fight the coronavirus because they're economy has been depleted and, sanctioned by the government's own ineptitude. The Ayatollah is not, the guy that you want running your, coronavirus response, but that's the position the Iranians find themselves in. But the crippling U.S. sanctions, I think, are definitely a major driver because Iran was known for a country that had a decent healthcare system before all this happened. Not, like the U.S., but I think as far as compared to, Middle East standards go.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that's what I have. Just they had the assets overseas, so I would imagine the IMF was going to seize anything. That would be the easiest targets over trying to take Iranian oil or, the money from the people. But, before we wrap up here, Will, we have kind of a sad anniversary to discuss, and that is Julian Assange's imprisonment in the maximum security, prison that the UK uses for terrorists, Belmarsh. He's up there with a bunch of murderers and thugs and he's there for skipping bail. And, his situation is, I would say, dire at this point. I've talked in the past on the show, and I think, Will's probably had these discussions with me that Assange's health isn't good. I mean, he was locked in the Ecodurian embassy for several years and now in a maximum security prison. That takes a toll on him. And not to mention, he's had like lagging healthcare needs that haven't been able to be addressed because he can't leave the Ecuadorian embassy. And, we know that prisoners get very poor healthcare, and Assange is likely in that category. Something that I've been talking about on the show since really the very beginning of my coronavirus analysis was, as much as I wasn't particularly concerned about myself from the coronavirus, prisons were one place that seemed to me they could absolutely run rampant. And so, we now have a situation where Julian Assange is in this, very dangerous prison that is known to have coronavirus cases. And he is, I think, somebody who would probably go in the, moderately high to just straight up, high severe risk factor of, you're going to need to be on a ventilator and possibly die of coronavirus, with his lung condition. And so because of this, his legal team, I believe, filed a motion basically saying that, hey, the UK government said they're going to let some nonviolent prisoners out of jail. Guys here are skipping bail. And, that's actually expired. And now he's just being held on the extradition here to the U.S. So let him go. They say that they can't do that for whatever reason. But a part of that was they kind of applied and said that turns out Julian Assange has a family, not a wife, but a partner and two children. And so they're not married, but they have two children together and are, coupled up, I suppose. The children and the wife ended up appearing in a video because the judge was going to expose their identity after they filed this, this motion and plea. So this was, I think, a pretty disgusting act that this has been kept quiet for a lot of time. I think, if Assange had made the appeal that I'm a father and I want to be able to go outside and throw a ball with my son, that could have been maybe something powerful, but at the same time, that's now going to expose his son to all this public attention. But the judge was just willing to bring that. And so I guess, the one thing that I have seen in this year of Julian Assange, this past year of Julian Assange being in prison, is just really, if the government doesn't want you to have a fair trial, you will not have a fair trial. So, well, I don't know what kind of comments or thoughts that you have on that or anything you want to add.
Well, yeah, that whole thing is just gross about, basically doxing Julian Assange's family. I don't know what the motivation could possibly be behind that, other than maybe just vitriol. Seems like there's been quite a few, ways in which Assange has been treated that reflect, that kind of just like vitriol toward him for, what he did exposing the crimes of our governments. But, after a whole year behind bars now, and, technically he's been behind bars a lot longer. I would consider his stay at the embassy basically being behind bars. He was in the tiny, cramped quarters for years. But after a year of him actually being in jail, I don't know if it could be much worse. Like, a year ago, I don't know if I would have imagined it, would be this bad. I certainly didn't foresee the whole pandemic aspect where now he's threatened by that, too. Like, for a long time, it was just his health problems that were such a issue. But now you actually do have cases of coronavirus in the Belmarsh prison. And so, I can only imagine what that, where that situation could go, especially with his pre-existing health conditions. He's definitely, he's definitely susceptible to something like the coronavirus. And so, yeah, I mean, it's only gotten more and more urgent and dire over the last year with Assange. I would have hoped that, maybe the UK government would have come around and, rejected the whole extradition request and all that. But no, of course not. That's moving ahead full steam. And so, yeah, I guess the only really way it could get worse at this point is if he were to be extradited, when that actually, when they actually make that when that verdict comes. So that's that's just about the only way it could get worse at this point.
I'll just add, for anybody who wants to really understand the importance of Julian Assange's fight here, I'm going to link to I think it's a Consortium News video. Aaron Mate hosts a panel of Marjorie Cohen, Daniel Ellsberg, and I believe Chris Hastings, and they just talk about the importance of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, and the situation in his fight, especially how dire his current situation is, and these are people who are just absolute experts and the most knowledgeable people about why the First Amendment is important, why whistleblowers are important, and why the works of Julian Assange is so important. They lay out just the absolute best case. They are, I believe, all, I don't know about Hastings for sure, but two of the three, including Mate, but he doesn't have much analysis, he's more host, are very leftist, but ignore the climate change stuff and just really absorb the importance of everything and the wisdom, especially Daniel Ellsberg is one of the great people that we have in this world. So Will, just to wrap up here, kind of transition, we've been doing this thing every week, essentially just talking about what's going on with the coronavirus for us. Sometimes you give us updates on numbers or different kind of things going on. I guess today's Easter, and so that brought a very interesting and scary level of authoritarianism in Kentucky, where a church decided to stay open, and the police came and are now trying to enforce, I guess, a quarantine of everybody who decided to go of 14 days. I saw the video there, and those cops were walking around putting out all the notices on the car without gloves or masks on. And we're certainly within 6 feet of all the different media and each other while they were doing it. But that was a sight I was very disturbed to see. That was something that I obviously is many steps too far. You got the First Amendment, a right to assemble, a freedom of religion, and this is being trampled on. So I don't know. That was kind of my, I think, big thing from the coronavirus this week is the enforcement of some of these draconian, not well thought out at all. They didn't stop to think about, what's going to happen if somebody wants to hold an Eastern, if one church wants to hold an Easter service in Kentucky. Is that really something that we want to send the police and try to enforce and lock all these people down for? These things were done, in reaction to a virus, in a hysteria, in a panic, and then nobody is ever willing to kind of walk it back and be like, maybe that was too far. Actually, we're not going to have the cops enforce this. But that's the state we're in, and all these Karens calling the cops on people. So I don't know, Will, how are things for you, and what are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these lockdown and restrictions and stuff, it is starting to get kind of overbearing. In my neck of the woods here in Southeast Michigan, or in Michigan in general, I should say, the governor actually just issued this ban on travel between residencies. And they're just like with most of the travel restrictions in the U.S., there are some, exceptions and stuff. But it's just that's a pretty intense thing to call on people. Like, you can't even visit other residents. They said that you can go if you're going to take care of a loved one or something, you can do that. But still, they are cracking down or stepping up on the lockdown measures here in Michigan, as it seems is happening across the country and much of the world, really. I think I had read that half of the world's population right now is under some form of travel restrictions or lockdown measures. You have all of India under a countrywide lockdown right now. That's over 1 billion people. It's crazy. But just in terms of where the virus is at now, I think this week it crossed the 1 million cases point, and now we're nearly at 2 million. I think by the time people hear this, it'll be at 1.9 million cases worldwide. And right now there are 114,000 deaths. So, if you go back and listen to our previous weeks covering this, like you can hear just week by week how much it's been climbing. Like it's growing by quite a bit. However, one promising thing, like the last few weeks, I've been saying, if you look at the graph, it looks like it's still just fully on the upswing. We're fully on the upside of the curve still. But now it seems after another week, if you start looking at like the daily case graphs, it's starting to sort of peter off a little bit. It's not just like on this like steep slope upward. You still do have a couple days, if you look at the graph, where they stick out, where there's like over 100,000 cases in one day. But it is starting to sort of like to flatten out a little bit, it looks like. It's not just on this like vertical spike upward, which it was for quite a while. And so I hope it, that trend continues. We start to see it flatten out, then ultimately start to level off. But yeah, this thing has gotten, much worse than I ever really thought it would. I've been watching it for quite a while, since like early January. I was watching it in China, and now to just see the whole map covered in red spots. I think it's like 185 countries right now that has it, out of only I think there's only like 190 countries or 200 countries in the whole world. So it's like everywhere. I'm just impressed too. If you look at some of these remote locations it ends up in, it's just like, how does it get there? Like, it's just crazy to think of but I guess that's just like a testament to just how, to travel now, how easy it is to just travel all around the world and spread this kind of stuff. I was actually watching a week or so ago. There's this video of like showing people on spring break in Florida, and just one beach of people. They tracked their phone data. They all agreed to it. And you can see how they all fan out across the country and across the world after like a week. And like, just to think about that in terms of like spreading a virus, it's like, okay, now I can really see how this thing spreads. And so it is pretty impressive. Like, this is a pretty impressive, successful little life form these viruses are.
Yeah, well, it's also just, we're saying that if people voluntarily consent and that technology exists, I'm sure they're plotting to use it without our consent right now as well. So, Will, thanks so much for coming back on the show. Hopefully we could do it again next Monday. Everybody, hopefully you're staying safe. You're avoiding doing as much stuff that you don't need to do as possible. And if you got some extra time on your hand, make sure you're following Will Porter somewhere, either on Facebook, Will Porter, easy to spell, or over on Twitter at WKPANCAP. Everything he writes, he posts up there. And you can check out the show at libertarianinstitute.org. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Cal.